There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's an unusual place to start a true crime story, at the National Gallery of Victoria in 1985. The director of the gallery, a man named Patrick McCaughey, purchases a single painting for $1.6 million. Due to currency fluctuations, the cost increases to $2 million, the most expensive purchase ever made by an Australian gallery. The painting is by Pablo Picasso, titled The Weeping Woman. The work represents suffering, oddly fitting for the story that was about to unfold. Also oddly fitting is the statement made by McCaughey upon announcing the purchase. He said of Picasso's Weeping Woman, "This face is going to haunt Melbourne for the next 100 years." And haunt Melbourne, it still does. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Walkley Award-winning journalist Mark Fennell. Mark is a journalist, author, TV presenter and documentary maker whose latest project, Framed, unpacks the story of when Picasso's Weeping Woman disappeared from the National Gallery of Victoria in 1986. I wanted to begin by asking about the painting of the Weeping Woman. Why is it significant? Why is it a big deal in the art world?
Well, one of Picasso's most important paintings is this big, huge artwork called Guernica, where he basically is depicting a massacre. And off that is two sort of spin-off paintings. And actually, the Weeping Woman that sits in Victoria is one of a few. There's another one like in the Tate in London. And it's important because of its relationship to Guernica, which is a very, very, very famous painting. And the fact that it's sort of like, it's like a copy of a copy, but also by Picasso. So it's one of the multiple versions of this picture that exists. So even from the outset, it's important really because it's Picasso, not necessarily because of the picture itself. And the reason it was bought for the NGV has very little to do with the picture itself. It has everything to do with the fact that Picasso is a well-known name and the NGV needed to have more well-known names in the gallery. So the picture itself, it's interesting asking people about the picture because some people bite their tongue and they're like, yeah, it's ugly. And it is, I mean, it's ugly in the sense that it's depicting a woman in tears and he had a very complicated relationship with this particular woman. And so, you know, there is a grotesqueness to the picture, but in some ways it's only important because of who painted it. And then, of course, because it was stolen.
It's interesting because it's not necessarily aesthetically pleasing in the way that some other Picassos might be, but as you say, it's notorious. And in Australia, it's a way of having European art in one of our galleries.
Yeah, and that's sort of at the very heart of it, right? Where they, in the end, when the final sums are done, they ended up paying about $2 million for it, which at the time made it the most expensive painting in Australia. And the fact that the most expensive painting in Australia was something that people kind of looked at and went, you know, it's fine, it's okay. And some people just had an outright, it's ugly reactions to it. In the making of the documentary, one of the things we actually did was we commissioned an artist to recreate it from scratch, partly because the gallery didn't want us inside filming the actual painting and weren't pleased we were doing it at all. But also, we wanted to get an understanding of the painting itself. It was interesting talking to this artist, Leslie Rice, who did this beautiful recreation of it. He just said, like, it's an affront. Like the colours, everything about the colours and the way it's laid out. He's got this, you know, sickly greens and weird purples and blues. It's designed to convey a sort of sickly quality to it, a deep sort of sad anger. And it's funny that, like, I guess that's what its legacy is. I mean, the guy that ran the NGV, the National Gallery of Victoria at the time, Patrick McCaughey, when they bought it, there's this quote that I think has come back many, many times, which is he said, "This painting will haunt the National Gallery of Victoria for 100 years. And I don't think he knew exactly how it was going to happen. But he was right. It has haunted that building for the longest time.
So they paid, as you say, sort of in the ballpark of $2 million. I mean, that would be a lot more now, I imagine, in 1985. Why was it so important for them to get an artwork of this calibre in there? Was it about basically Australia trying to get on the map in terms of art galleries?
That is exactly it. If you want to be regarded as a top-tier gallery, and this is as true now as it was then, if you want to be regarded as a top-tier gallery, there are some names. You just need to check off the list, and Picasso is very high on that list. You want to have a collection of well-known brand name artists in your collection. And look, the National Gallery of Victoria, it actually performs quite well on that metric. It does have a number of incredibly famous artists, but at this particular point in time, there was very little support, and everybody acknowledges this. There was very little support for Australian artists. It was almost like there was art and then there was Australian art, and they're like the separate things. And one is worth supporting, one will attract a crowd, art, and then there's this other thing that feels like a chore, Australian art. And it seems that Australian artists were really annoyed at that. And at least some of them, it would seem, decided to do something very drastic. And that is sort of what leads us into the theft itself.
What do we know about what happened on that night on August the 2nd, 1986?
Well, what do we know about what happened? That's a good question, because the we is the operative part in that. Because one thing that was really telling when we started working on this particular film is that everybody we spoke to, everybody absolutely knows who stole the Weeping Woman. The problem is, not one of those people agrees on who that person actually is. And so everybody has a very clear, almost in their mind, this is a fact, idea as to what happened that day. But actually, none of those things align. And so what we sort of did was we were like, okay, let's go back and stress test all of these rumours. And that's what we set out to do. Every single one of the rumours, put it to the test. There's a few mutually accepted things. So we are pretty confident it was taken on the Saturday, certainly over the weekend. We know that the gallery were not necessarily aware of it until the Monday. And we know that it probably almost definitely involved somebody that definitely knew their way around the gallery. Now, that could mean a range of things, right? At this particular point in time, the art gallery had an open door for all intents and purposes with what is now the Victorian College of the Arts. So imagine you have an art gallery filled with some of the most expensive paintings in the world, and the art school next door where students, and frankly anybody, could walk in and out day or night anytime they want. No CCTV. Most of the security guards at the time were sort of retired, old guys. There was like industrial action at this point in time because they wanted to take away the chairs. The security guards would sit there in their chairs, arms folded. They wanted to take away the chairs. So the guards went on strike. So you've got a vexatious relationship with your security guards, which is also a complicated thing to happen in and around a major theft. And so what happens is we know that the painting is taken. We know that the first inkling people get that something is wrong is when a letter turns up in the newspaper. And the letters basically taunt the gallery. They taunt the minister. At the time, it was a really unusual situation. Race Matthews was the Minister for Arts and the Minister for Police at the same time. And they taunt him specifically. And they make a series of demands. And the demands include, amongst other things, a demand for setting up an art prize called the Picasso ransom, which was obviously never going to happen. But also the main thing is they wanted more arts funding. And so for that reason, people tend to assume that it was young artists that were involved. But it probably was involving more than one person. And there were other theories that emerged with other letters that perhaps it was something that happened because of a revenge against somebody specific, and perhaps the whole thing was just an elaborate prank gone out of hand. So what do we know? We know a painting was taken, and that's about the only thing we know.
Tell me about taking the painting, because I would imagine if someone sort of baseline told me this story, that someone's walking into a gallery, lifting it off a wall, walking out the front door with a massive painting tucked under their arm. That's not quite how it happened, was it? So did they take the painting off the frame? Like, how did they do it?
So the painting was taken off the wall. At the time, they were using a special kind of screw, which was called a snake eyes screw. And the reason that's important is because Instead of like your normal sort of Phillips head, it's got two little prongs in it. And what that means is you needed a very specific screwdriver to get it into the wall. That particular fact has meant that for many years, people just are absolutely convinced that it needed to be somebody who was internal, somebody inside the art gallery that knew how those screws went in. We spoke to the head conservator of the art gallery at the time, and he's of the view that, sure, you needed a specific screwdriver if you wanted to get it in the wall, but to get it out, you could have just pulled it out. We don't know whether those screws were used. No one's ever found the screws. But this is what I mean when I say, like, there's all these things that have become accepted fact, but actually if you put them under the microscope, they don't quite stack up. So we know that it was attached with screws of some kind, and we know it was taken off the wall. It was taken out of the frame because the frame was found. One of the first things they found, and really one of the first inkling that something was wrong, was the frame was found in an alcove in the gallery. And one of the reasons why people didn't really realise it was stolen is it was quite common to take things off the wall and put a little sign up on the wall with a registrar's notice saying this has been moved to somewhere. And what had happened is when the painting went missing, there was a sign placed on it which said, gone to the ACT. And everyone just assumed, they must have sent it off to Parliament House down in Canberra. But of course, then the letters arrive. And the letters are signed the Australian Cultural Terrorists, ACT. And they start putting two and two together. And then they find the frame. And then once they've found the frame, they know it's gone. It's not in the building now. And people really start to panic. And the panic sets in pretty drastically. And to this day, if you talk to people that worked in the NGV at that time, they are still traumatised by it. The sense that you have a painting on the wall that has cost $2 million has disappeared and you are being taunted in the press. It's absolutely insane. It really is. And they're really, like, even now, like, you can feel like the shudder in their voice when they talk about it because it was such a massive thing. And of course, the most important part about this, which I didn't realise until when we started digging into this, is that the painting was uninsured, which to me sounds absolutely bonkers. But it turns out they never insure paintings when they're on the wall. You insure it when it's in transit, when it's moving. But when it's on the wall, it's too expensive. It's way too expensive to pay for insurance. So what you've got to rely on is the security. And in 1986, security at the NGV was nothing compared to what we have now. There was no CCTV cameras. You've got basically retirees doing security. You've got an open door with the art school out the back and 1,000 places to hide. What people don't realise about art galleries is that in an effort to have as much wall space, they often build kind of fake walls and alcoves and things like that. Talking to people who were there was 1 million places to hide. And so the view forms that somebody walked in on a Friday, stayed the night. There are versions of the story that says they even brought some beers in to kind of steady their nerves. And then they took it out of the painting, wrapped it up, and walked out the door. And the doorman opened the door for them.
Where did the police start with that? Had they ever heard of the Australian cultural terrorists before? What were their kind of early leads?
No one had ever heard of the Australian cultural terrorists before this. The police officer who headed the investigation, a guy named Bob Quigley, the first time he's ever properly spoken was to us for Framed. And, he took it then and he takes it now very seriously. But at the same time, 1980s cops entering the world of art, I think there was a real sort of cultural mismatch. I think the impression I get talking to people is people in the art world felt like the cops were completely bumbling and didn't know what they're doing, whereas you talk to the cops and they were taking it quite seriously. Because remember, Race Matthews, who's being taunted in the press, is the arts minister and the police minister, right? So your boss is definitely being taunted every day in the age, right? So the cops, the first thing they do is they rock up. They have all these police recruits rock up at the NGV and they ransack the place. And that's when they find the frame. And that's when they know something serious has happened. Now, there's a few really interesting things happening behind the scenes. There was a concern early on that the painting might have been taken by kind of high-class art thieves who were going to sell it off in the black market. There was concerns that they might be making a copy and what would return would not be the real one. And so the head conservator, a guy named Tom Dixon, does this interesting thing. Every time an artwork comes into the gallery, they do a report, and it's this incredibly detailed report where, like, if there's a bubble on the paint at 3 centimetres in from the left, they record it. Every single millimetre of this painting they record. And he did the report on the Weeping Woman and he misfiled it. As soon as he realised it was stolen, he misfiled it. Why did he do that? Well, he did it because he was concerned that if a painting came back, that if somebody knew every detail about the painting, they could recreate those details and they could pass it into the system. So he made the decision that he was going to make sure that he was the only person who could ever know any of those details, and he hid the file. And he's telling me this story and I'm just like, what were you worried about? He's like, from his point of view, it's like when you do one of those reports, every time you do one of those reports, you are putting your career on the line. And he was in that moment. On the off chance that somebody had tried to make a perfect copy and then pass it back and then sell the real one into the black market, he kept this report so that whatever they returned back with, no one could have tampered with it and nobody knew where he kept it. So it's fascinating. Like the level of paranoia that kicked into gear was high.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Walkley Award-winning journalist Mark Fennell about the disappearance of Picasso's Weeping Woman from the National Gallery of Victoria in 1986. So this is on the Saturday that it's disappeared. By Monday, another Weeping Woman turns up in Sydney. Can you explain that story?
So as soon as the painting went missing, the art world went a bit berserk because artists everywhere kind of were very sympathetic with the cause of the Australian cultural terrorists, who were basically saying, we've taken this picture ransom and we're going to hold it ransom until you deliver decent arts funding for all these starving young Australian artists out here. You spend $2 million in this painting, give us some money. So artists everywhere around Australia were really enthused about this. And suddenly, all of these fakes start popping up all around the country. There was dozens of them found in Adelaide, all around, and the artists were playing with the cops. They were absolutely playing with the cops. This is amazing, bizarre news footage of this bumbling sort of Victoria Police rocking up to an art space in Adelaide, being like, I don't think this is one of them, just genuinely looking confused. But there is one painting that I think tells you something about this case. So the painting we know was stolen on the weekend, but they didn't know about it. People didn't know about it. It didn't make the news until really Monday afternoon, which is confusing because about 2 hours after the first public announcement that the painting was missing, a replica went on display, a perfect replica or a very good replica went on display in Sydney at Sydney University. Sydney University used to have this thing called the Gadigal Gallery, which was literally like you've got a wall, sort of corrugated iron wall, but inside is a glass box, and they would just put an artwork in there. And 2 hours after the announcement that the painting had been missing, a perfect replica appeared in the Gadigal Gallery in Sydney, which I'm like, all right, okay. But the thing is, the artist who did that painting, they were in Melbourne. So somehow they have managed to paint a perfect replica, have it transferred from Melbourne to Sydney with less than 2 hours' notice. That seems sus. And so for the longest time, most of the documentation around it has insisted that the art opening was actually Wednesday, which would have given them ample time to kind of replicate it, get it shipped. But actually, we found the original invitation. The original invitation absolutely says Monday, 6:30. Everybody I've spoken to, and there is a range of opinions about this, most people find it very suspicious. Very, very suspicious that an artwork could be made and transported with less than 2 hours' notice. And so I think what that says is that at least within the wider art world, people knew. Either people knew it was going to happen or people knew before it happened, before it was public. That's certainly not to say that this particular artist was involved. There's no evidence I can point to saying this particular artist was involved in the theft of the Weeping Woman. But what it does suggest is that people knew. People knew that it had happened. And people knew it had happened possibly before it happened, but definitely in between when it happened and when the public knew. And that it feels like there was like an above ground world and an underground world view of this event. And to that extent, that perception has persisted. People within the art world still, many of them regard it as basically a good thing, because shortly thereafter, after this theft happened, arts funding changed. Young artists were started to get supported. The NGV as an institution started to take Australian artists more seriously. As a political act, as a prank, as a piece of performance art, it's still lauded. But what that misses is that there was a domino effect. There was a chain reaction started by this crime, and it ended up really massively damaging some people who had nothing to do with it. And they never got their front pages. They never got their story told. And that's actually kind of why this was important. To me, anyway, this is why this was important, because, yes, it's a funny, entertaining crime. There's no question. It's very entertaining. But, when we do sort of crime conversations, often we talk about who done it and how done it and why done it. But sometimes I think it's really important to make sure you pay attention to who it was done to and also the unintended victims. And this story is filled with unintended victims. Patrick McCaughey, the guy who ran the NGV at the time, he wrote a memoir and he called this whole thing a victimless crime. And for a victimless crime, this left a really long trail of victims, some of whom should never have been drawn into it, but they were, and had a really devastating impact on them.
Who were some of those unintended victims that we might not necessarily think about on the surface who suffered long term?
So when the police wanted to find out what happened, they did two things. They set up a $50,000 reward, and they set up a tip line where people could call in and name people who they think might be involved. Unfortunately, what actually happened is that a whole bunch of people within the arts community used that tip line to settle scores. And so there were different people who would call up the tip line and go, "This woman, I reckon she did it." And they'd invent whole backstories accusing people who had nothing to do with it. And that's what we sort of uncover, which is that there's two sort of main stories of people. One is an artist who the police never thought of him as a serious contender, but rumours were allowed to spread that he was involved, and it decimated his career for a period of time. And then there's another couple who the tip line was basically weaponised against them for something completely unrelated a few years earlier. And the woman ended up leaving Australia because it was so devastating. And the man who was an artist at the time, he just never quite recovered. I'm being a bit circumspect, as you can tell. But I think it's important with stories like this that, there are people who ended up on front pages and ended up getting lots and lots of coverage. But sometimes there are all these unintended consequences. And I think that's the stuff that I'm fascinated by. I'm fascinated by all the people who, like, it's funny, I make a true crime series and at a certain point I become completely disinterested with who actually did it and much more interested in totally innocent people that were at the tail end of a domino effect that should never have been drawn into it. I think that's really the heart of the story for me. It's all the people that should never have had this happen to them, but did. And it's all because of the theft of the Weeping Woman.
Because while that exists, there's people who absolutely suffered. For some people, this was a funny story, not least because of those letters. The letters were very witty. They had a lot of tone. What else were they sort of saying over that 2 or so week period?
Yeah, and I should point out that, like, just because there is a sad component to it, there is also this very entertaining part. And I don't think those two things cancel each other out. I don't think they balance each other out. I just think they simply coexist, which is what I like about, being able to kind of step through it methodically. The letters are enormously entertaining. They're just massively, massively funny. They were witty. They were mean. They were bitchy. They were massively overwritten. They're really, the art gallery didn't even know about the letters until they would magically pop up in the newspapers. So can you imagine, going into work going, what are the thieves going to taunt us with now? There were a few letters, and then there was at least one letter that happened 10 years afterwards. And no one can really say whether that letter is a true letter or like a fan letter. No one knows. But that letter that happens 10 years afterwards actually posits a completely different version of events as to what had been accepted. So this is what I mean. Everybody knows exactly how it happened. No one can agree. And so the letters they're just really funny. And one of the things we got people to do in the series is we got all of the players to go back and reread the letters out for us.
Okay. The famous letters.
Yes, the Australian cultural terrorists.
We have stolen the Picasso from the National Gallery as a protest
against the niggardly
funding of the fine arts in this hick state.
There will be no negotiations.
At the end of 7 days, if our demands have not been met, the painting will be destroyed.
Your very humble servants, Australian cultural terrorists.
And you just like the differences in reactions. So like Virginia Trioli, who lots of people will know from TV and radio. She was a young journo at the time who kind of covered the story 10 years after it happened. And the glee on Virginia's face as she rereads these letters, the joy emanates off her. It's delightful to watch her read it. Whereas you go to the cop who was there at the time or to the conservator and they read it now and it's like their reactions are so interesting. The cop's just like very unimpressed, very, very unimpressed. Whereas the conservator is in this interesting space where he was so stressed about it at the time. But now he reads and goes, oh, this is almost funny. I didn't, like, you can see him going, wow, I can't believe we took this seriously. But of course we did, and they were right to, but at the same time, it's like, it's written like a joke. So it's in this weird space between like a very serious crime and a prank and maybe a bit of performance art and a sort of an act of political theatre. It's just wild. The whole thing is just, every time we dip back into it and, you know, we're just sort of finishing off the series at the moment, I just think it's just this unbelievable part of Australia's history, a part of our recent history, and I just think more people should know about this utterly strange crime that happened on our soil. Just is, and it says so much about, you know, what we value. We put all this money into a Picasso, but there was this incredibly vibrant, kind of rat-baggy arts community who were just like, what about us? You know, if you accept that it definitely involved some young artists, which I think is a semi-reasonable theory, the fact that they enacted this theft is on one level an enormously amazing statement, like an incredible statement. But then also there's unintended consequences. And I don't know. I just think it's one of those things where I've always been fascinated by history, like, because to me, you know, you and I, we are the last chapter in a story that has stretched on for centuries and centuries. And whether it's the podcast I do for the ABC called Stuff the British Stole or something like Framed for SBS, it's like understanding where we were before make sense of how we live now. And I just think this crime says so much about what we care about in Australia and what we value.
And I think our national character, it says something about what it means to be quintessentially Australian, because there is something in the larrikinism, in the subversion, in the transgression of a class that just stuck their tongue out at Picasso and went, you think you're so good? Well, we'll do heaps of replicas, confuse you for no reason, and all to make performance art that was a good point, but you're just seeing these, and I don't think necessarily calling them elite is fair, but members of the elite tearing their hair out and a sort of different class laughing behind their backs. It's very Australian.
It is. And you know what? You've hit the nail on the head, and I think you're the first person to actually point out the class component to it, because we do like to imagine Australia as being a classless country, but of course it isn't, and it never has been. But it does highlight the fact that, you know, on one hand you've got this world of kind of rich Toorak money, and then you've got, at the time, sort of, you know, starving artists around Fitzroy and places like that. And the interesting thing is those young artists who were sort of implicated and who were looked at the time, some of those artists are now the most, you know, financially well-off artists in Australia. So there is a sort of, you know, you see the passing of time through this story a little bit. But yeah, no, it does absolutely speak to the degree of elitism that's built into this crime. You know, they paid that money because of something that was regarded as valuable. It was regarded as valuable because it was a European master, because they knew it would attract crowds, sure. But also there is an underlying elitism to the art world. And I don't think I'm speaking massively out of school when I say that. I think that's generally understood. But at the same time, you know, one of the things I love about this story is the cop, Bob Quigley, has really, you know, he paints, his wife paints. They have really beautifully, like, they actually gave the best, I think, review of the painting to me. Like, you know, he really cared. He really cared about why the painting existed, what it meant to Picasso. I was like, it's one of those great examples where people are not necessarily caricatures. They have lots of care and love about them, about different things. And I think, you know, Bob in particular, I think the cop, I think it genuinely annoys him that it remains unsolved. And I don't blame him. He poured years of his life into this thing, and he has no love of criminals. That goes without saying. But I think, for his view, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, is that it was just a selfish act, a really selfish act that hurt a lot of people. And he's right. But this is the thing, all of these things can be right at the same time. And indeed they are. It can be entertaining, it can be devastating, it can be heartbreaking, it can be unfair, it can be an act of internal justice to young artists. It can be all of these things at once. And that's what this crime is. What it is how people remember it, and the story that they've told each other, and the story that they've come to believe. That's what this crime is. It is a Rorschach test for people's memory.
That's what I think makes it so compelling. And talk us through the anonymous tip-off on August 19. So that's a little over 2 weeks since the painting first went missing. What happened from there?
So there was a call to The Age. A very young journalist by the name of Margaret Simon was told, we just got a call from the ACT, the Australian Cultural Terrorists. They've said go down to Spencer Street Station, what is now Southern Cross Station in Melbourne. And she and another of her colleagues goes down there, and they go to locker 227, and then they're like, well, what do we do? What do we do? We call the cops. Shortly thereafter, the cops, but very quickly, Patrick McCaughey, the director of the National Gallery of Victoria, is there, and they're pacing around. They're really nervous. And, Patrick's saying things like, I can feel her. I can feel she's in there. And, of course, they open it up, and there is a package. Looks like a painting, but could be a bomb. Who knows? Don't know. They send it off to forensics. They open it up, and there is the painting. 2 interesting things about this story. One, inside the painting is yet another letter. The letter continues to taunt Race Matthews and the gallery, but the letter also says that this is phase 1, that more will come. But there is a sort of hidden component to this story that didn't come out for years. Years later, Patrick McCaughey wrote down in his memoir that he had a conversation with the cops, and the cops said to him, you know what, why don't you just go quietly talk to a bunch of artists and say, look, we just want the picture back. If it turns up in Tullamarine Airport or Spencer Street Station, they would be good locations for it to turn up. We know he went and spoke to at least one artist. In his book, he named this artist as Tom. We later realised that this artist is a real person by the name of Mark Howson. And so he goes to Mark Howson, him and another artist, they go to Mark Howson, they say, look, we're not saying you're involved, but if it was to turn up at Spencer Street Station or Tullamarine, that would be great. A couple of days after that, it turns up in Spencer Street Station. Now, here's the thing. The cops, Bob Quigley, absolutely refute they ever had this conversation with Patrick McCaughey. The cops are agog that Patrick McCaughey would even say this. The idea that the cops would say to a person involved in the case, why don't you go talk to a suspect and tell them it doesn't matter, you're not going to be followed up, and why don't you just put it in this location? The cops absolutely refute Patrick McCaughey's version of this history. Mark Howson didn't realise any of this stuff was going on. But what did happen was that rumours started to spread. Patrick McCaughey goes, visits him. A couple of days after that, it turns up, must have been him. Must have been him is the theory and the rumour that starts to spread. The cops have never, ever thought that Mark Howson was involved. Ever, at all. They haven't investigated it. But what did happen was the rumours spread so much, and the rumours were toxic, that this guy was involved. And he feels like it had a massive impact on his career to have people assume that he was involved in this art crime. And McCaughey doesn't want to talk about it. He put it in his book. He certainly didn't want to talk about it with us. And so what it says to me is that, and it's a really interesting object lesson in the damage of rumours, the really palpable damage of rumours, because it's conceivable that Patrick McCaughey had this conversation with a number of artists, but this mud stuck to Mark Howson. And why, Patrick McCaughey chose to put that in his book when it could be so easily, refuted by the cops is a question I would love an answer to, but I don't have one because Patrick doesn't want to talk. So, I think it's certainly convenient that Patrick McCaughey went around and spoke to some artists, and then a couple of days after that, the painting was returned exactly to the places that he said. And, there's footage of him at Spencer Street Station the night of saying things like, well, I thought it would return to Tullamarine or Spencer Street Station. So legally speaking, we can't and I would never make an aspersion, but certainly it's important when you lay it all out, it does seem like, Markhausen copped it in ways that I don't think it took him years to work out what had actually happened. Markhausen does say that he feels like it's been personally quite a damaging episode in his life because of how this played out. And the cops, to this day, maintain that they had no idea that McCaughey was out there, putting the hard word on artists. We know at least one, but we don't know how many. And so, let's just say that there are really different interpretations of how that chapter went down.
Finally, do you reckon we're ever going to find out who was behind it? And do you think that even really matters anymore?
It's a good question. One day we will know. I think it's astonishing that for 35 years Melbourne has been able to hold on to this secret. It's absolutely amazing to me because people know. People know the how, they know the why, they know. Somebody will talk eventually. And my theory is that when they realise that it wasn't just all fun and games, that it wasn't just a prank, that there was a real impact on people's lives, when they realise that, my theory is that people will come out and talk about it more. Does it matter? It's a really good point. I, myself and the team that made Framed, I'm of the view that it does matter, but it doesn't matter as much as making sure that the people whose stories didn't get told get their chance to be heard. I think what matters to me more is the impact of the crime. And actually, of all those things, what matters to me most is the impact. And secondary to that is knocking apart the rumours. So, debunking all of these urban myths that have permeated the city for 35 years. Those two things matter most to me. And then a distant third is who actually did it. And I know that's a slightly controversial view to take. Who did it is like a distant third in my priority list. Debunking the myths and making sure that the people who are hurt are heard, those things matter more to me.
Mark Fennell is a Walkley-winning journalist, presenter, author and documentary maker who's been honoured internationally by the Webby Awards and America's coveted James Beard Foundation Award. You may have heard his voice previously on ABC Radio Sydney or seen him as host of Mastermind Australia and The Feed on SBS. His latest project, Framed, is a 4-part documentary about the disappearance of Picasso's Weeping Woman from the National Gallery of Victoria. You'll be able to stream all 4 episodes this Boxing Day exclusively on SBS On Demand. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Gia Moylan. If you liked this episode, then please leave us a review in your Apple Podcast app. Or if you have a case that you think we should cover next, you can contact us via email at truecrime@mamamia.com.au. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you'd like to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamamia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as Cancelled, a comedy podcast about the stories of celebrity cancellations.